one of the blessings on, again, the blessing, this week's parsha talks about Jacob's passing and how he blesses his children before he passes away, and each one gets a specific blessing. There is a Hasidic custom that every day of the week we study one section of the parsha. So the parsha is divided into 7 readings. On Shabbat there are 7 aliyot, 7 people get called up to the Torah, plus an 8th for the maftir, but in general there are 7 readings. So the Hasidic custom is that every day we study one section of that parsha. So on Sunday you read the first reading, Monday the second reading, etc. So today is the 6th reading, and the 6th reading is the final blessing of the 12 sons. The way they divide the readings, it's not the way one would think. In other words, we separate the first 11 children from the 12th. The truth of the matter is that the blessings of the first sons are divided between the 4th and 5th reading. But the 6th reading only has one, and that's Benjamin. And Benjamin has a fascinating blessing, but it's not together with the other sons. So from the Hasidic perspective, once we analyze and figure out what the best blessing to Benjamin is, we will understand why it's in the 6th reading, not together with the other sons, because it's really very much related with the story of what takes place in the 6th reading, which is really the overarching idea of at least the second half of the book of Genesis. So there's a lot going on, a lot to cover. But we have to begin, of course, with the verse, and then with the Rashi, and the questions on Rashi. And this is poetry, so Rashi himself has multiple interpretations. And once we do all the hard work, all the drilling, we'll get to some of the Kabbalah and some of the insight. And that's where the relevance is, because of course, it's not just Jacob telling Benjamin how great he was, but every blessing applies to the entire Jewish people, and it's relevant to us as we sit here today in 2020. Oh, no, sorry, 2021. First time I could say that. Wonderful. Okay. So we turn to the parsha. I'm going to try to share the screen. We turn to the parsha. As you see here, you have the 6th reading. Let's move this video out of the side. 6th reading, right? Shishi, 6th reading. 4th and 5th with the other blessings. And finally, you get to the 6th reading. All you have is Benjamin. Benjamin is a wolf. He will prey. Prey, Yitraf is not really prey. Yitraf is devour. In the morning, he will devour plunder, and in the evening, he will divide the spoil. Okay, so if you have a wolf, the wolf goes out, and the wolf goes hunting, and the wolf devours plunder in the morning, and also in the evening. So this is a metaphor for something. Rashi addresses what it's a metaphor for. We'll get to that later. We'll get to that in a minute. But before we get to the Rashi, you see that verse 28 is already a different subject. That's already the conclusion. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father spoke to them and blessed them. Each man, according to his blessing, he blessed them. Okay, fine. So 28 is already the conclusion. And then he goes back to reiterate, I'm going to pass away, take me back to Israel, bury me in the cave of Machpelah, where my ancestors are buried, etc., etc. And then we have the description of the passing and the funeral procession, etc., etc. But in the 6th reading, today's reading, we begin just with Benjamin, and that's all. Now, what does this mean? What does it mean Benjamin is a wolf, right? If your father calls you on his deathbed and said, you're a wolf, you devour prey, how would that make you feel? So what does this refer to? Then there's the morning. What is it? Then there's the evening. So we're going to open Rashi, and Rashi has multiple interpretations, but every clause of this blessing has to be analyzed according to Rashi. Once we do so, we start getting into the Hasidic interpretation, as we said. So we're going to show Rashi's commentary. As you see, it's long. Okay, so you got 2 words of the verse, has a whole bunch of Rashis here. So we'll start from the beginning. Benjamin is a wolf, he will prey. So Rashi says, I'm on the first Rashi in the shaded box. He is a wolf, for he will prey. He, Jacob, prophesied that they were destined to be grabbers. And Rashi quotes the verse, and you shall grab for yourselves each man his wife. Judges chapter 21. In the episode of the concubine who happened to be in Geba. That's in Judges chapter 19 and 21. So we'll talk about that. The Rashi says, okay, let's continue reading. And he prophesied about Saul, who was the descendant of Benjamin, that he would be victorious over his enemies all around. As it is said, and Saul took the kingdom, and he waged war against Moab, and against the children of Ammon, and against Edom, etc. And wherever he turned, he caused them to tremble. That's a verse in Samuel chapter 14. What does Rashi say? Binyamin is a wolf that preys or that devours. So the second interpretation is actually straightforward. Second interpretation is that the verse Jacob is prophesying about a descendant of Shaul who will then devour his enemies. Who's the descendant of Shaul who will devour? What am I saying? Descendant of Benjamin who will devour his enemies. Who is the descendant of Benjamin who will devour his enemies? That's Shaul, King Saul. King Saul, the first Jewish king, was a descendant from the tribe of Benjamin. And he is so powerful that he overtakes all of his enemies, and he conquers all of his enemies. And in that sense, he is a wolf that devours. That's the second interpretation of Rashi. What is the first interpretation of Rashi? That is totally strange. The first interpretation of Rashi is that when it says Benjamin will devour means to grab. Grab means grab something that doesn't belong to you. So Rashi says this is a reference to a story that's going to happen later in Jewish history, and is a terrible story, maybe the most terrible story in all of Tanakh and all of the Bible. And at the end of that story, the children of Benjamin have to grab wives from the other tribes to marry. And Jacob is prophesying about that event. And that's what he says. He says that you're going to grab wives, and that's Binyamin will be a devouring wolf. Devouring means you take something that doesn't belong to you. What's the story where they'll have to will they have to devour wives? So you may have heard of it. It's a terrible story. It's called Pilegesh Begiva. It is a concubine in the Giva. That's the name of it. It takes 2 chapters, at the last 2 chapters of the book of Judges. And basically, many people believe the point of that story, or why it's included in the Bible, in addition to its historic relevance, is to make the point of what happens when there's no king in Israel. And when there's no king in Israel, there's no central power, then one tribe can become very morally debased, and it can create civil war. And in some sense, that's the justification for what's going to happen in the next book, in the book of Samuel, where the people ask for a king. So what's the story? In short, without going into all the details, in short, there was a Levite man, and he had a concubine, and he came to Giva. And long story short, the mob of the children of Benjamin, a mob comes, and they surround him, and they want to attack him and violate him. Long story short, he gives them his concubine. They violate her all night. In the morning, she comes back home. She dies on the doorstep. He is so distraught, and he wants to make the point and get it into the press of this terrible crime, but there was no Twitter. So what do you do back then? This is a horrible story. He basically cuts her corpse into 12 or 11 and sends a piece to each one of the tribes, because he has to shake them up of their complacency of this terrible moral sin. The tribes hear what happens, they get the news, and they come to the tribe of Benjamin, and they basically say, give us the sinners, give us the people who committed this terrible crime, we want to punish them. And Benjamin refused to do so. Benjamin says they harbor the criminals. They say, we're not giving up the criminals. So the Jewish people decide that they're going to war against Benjamin. And we have a whole description of how the battle panned out. Initially, it looked like the people of Benjamin would be victorious because they were great warriors. Long story short, at the end of their ordeal, the entire tribe of Benjamin is wiped out. Entire tribe of Benjamin is wiped out. They're left with 600 people. The problem now is with their cities, men, women, and children destroyed. The problem now is that these 600 people cannot marry anybody. Why can't they marry anybody? because before the Jews went to war, they all took an oath that nobody's going to give their daughters to the tribe of Benjamin. And now, all of a sudden, the entire tribe is wiped out, or almost wiped out. They only have 600 people left. And they feel that there's a terrible danger now that an entire tribe is going to be eliminated from the Jewish people. So they realize that we have a problem. So how do they survive? How do they solve the problem? We have the oath. So there's a detail. There was one town that did not go to war. So the tribe of Benjamin, so they didn't take this oath. So those men marry some woman from that town, but then we still need more wives. So what happens was in the summertime, there was a festival where the girls of Shiloh of Judea, Shiloh is in Joseph, it's in Samaria, where the girls would go out and dance in the orchards or in the vineyards. That's what the custom of summer festival. So the people told Benjamin, you go out, and told the people of Benjamin, you go. And when the girls are going out dancing, you'll run and each person will go and grab a wife. What do I mean by grab a wife? It means without the consent of her family, because the family is not allowed to consent to this marriage. Because the family, the fathers, they promised that they're not going to give their children to the tribe of Benjamin. But you could take, if you take, you take. And that's not our fault. And that's the story. And by the way, in the middle of the summer, there's a holiday called Tu B'Av, the 15th of Av, and the Mishnah says there was never a greater holiday in Israel than the 15th of Av. Many things happened on 15th of Av. One of those things that happened was that's the day that the people of Benjamin came and they took their wives from the girls of Shiloh, and they were able to rehabilitate the tribe. So that's a fascinating story, a terrible story, very tragic story. Again, if you want all the details, you can read about it in the last 2 chapters of the book of Judges. Of course, the big question is, what is it doing here? This is a blessing to Benjamin. So the second interpretation of Rashi is very logical. Second interpretation of Rashi is the blessing to Benjamin is that they will have a descendant, the first Jewish king named Shaul, Saul, who will fight all the enemies, devour them, and eat the spoils. Wonderful, how inspiring. But Rashi puts that as the second interpretation, not the first. What's the first interpretation? This terrible story. What's the big blessing? The worst episode in Jewish history in the land of Israel. That's the blessing that Jacob is blessing Benjamin. That's inconceivable. It's unbelievable. It's puzzling. It's an understatement. Okay, let's continue. We're not done yet. Let's continue. Continue through this verse. Continue through the Rashi on this verse. Okay. In the morning he will devour plunder. So the Hebrew ad, an expression of plunder and spoils, translated into Aramaic as ada'ah. Okay, so there is another example of this use in Hebrew. Then plunder and booty ad shalal were divided. Okay, the problem is that the word ad literally means until. So it's not so common for the word ad to mean plunder. But here Rashi brings biblical sources from Isaiah and from the Aramaic translation of the Torah that plunder could also be called ad. Okay, fine. But what are we referring to? Jacob is referring to Saul, who arose in the beginning of the morning and sunrise of Israel. From Esther Rabbah, that's the Medrash. In other words, what's Rashi saying? Rashi says, let's look at the verse. What does the verse say? In the morning, he will devour plunder. What is the morning? What time? 8 o'clock in the morning? So we say, what is morning? Morning means the beginning of the shining of Israel. What's the beginning of shining of Israel? That's the beginning of the period of the kings. Before the kings, it's not really a kingdom. You have 12 different tribes, and they're not unified, they're not consolidated. And so you see what happens in this story of what we just read. We have that civil war between the 10 tribes, between the 11 tribes and the tribe of Benjamin. But Saul is the beginning of the shining of the Jewish people. So again, according to Rashi, the second clause, in the morning he will devour plunder, is really a continuation to the second interpretation of Benjamin is a wolf, a devouring wolf. And who's the devouring wolf? Saul. Saul is the morning. Now, what does the evening mean? If Saul is the beginning of Jewish history, is the beginning of the Jewish history of the monarchy is Saul, what's the end? This is fascinating. The end is the period after the sun sets. I'm sorry, the evening. What's the evening? After the sun sets. What does it mean after the sun sets? after the temple is destroyed. What happens after the temple is destroyed? The Jews are in exile. Then you have the story of Haman who wants to destroy all the Jews. What happens then? You have Mordechai and Esther, who are the leaders of the Jewish people. Mordechai and Esther in the story of Purim are the descendants of Benjamin. The Megillah, chapter 2 of the Scroll of Esther, says Ish Yehudi, there was a Jewish man, a man of Judea, a Jewish man in Shushan Habira, and Shushan the capital. His name, Mordechai, son of Yair, son of Shimi, son of Kish, Ish Yemini, a Benjaminite. Okay? So now we see that and what happens with Mordechai and Esther? Well, eventually they go to war against their enemies and they take their plunder. They don't take the plunder of battle. The Megillah says many times, the scroll says many times, they did not take the plunder. However, what they do get is Achashverosh, the king of Persia, gives Mordechai and Esther the house of Haman. So the house of Haman now is given to them. What does that represent? They get the plunder from Haman. So that's Rashi. Let's read the second Rashi. And in the evening, he will divide the spoil, even when the sun will set for Israel, through Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylon, who will exile them to Babylon. He, Benjamin, will divide the spoil. What is that referring to? Mordechai and Esther, who were of the tribe of Benjamin, will divide the spoils of Haman, as it is said, behold, the house of Haman I have given to Esther. That's from the Medrash against Esther Rabbah. Okay, so that's the interpretation. So according to this, we have the interpretation of both the morning and the evening. Give me just a moment. I want to pull something up here. Okay. So now that's Rashi's interpretation. But Rashi is kind enough, and Rashi tells us there's another interpretation out there. The last three lines. Onkelos, however, rendered it as regarding the spoils of the priests, i.e., the holy things of the temple, namely the priest's share of the sacrifices. So what I did is I just pulled up the interpretation of Onkelos, and it reads as follows. I'm translating. Binyamin, what does it mean? He's a devouring wolf. In his land, in his portion, the divine presence will dwell. In his heritage, the temple will be built. So in other words, the Onkelos is saying that the wolf is the temple. Wolf is the altar that devours the offerings. What's the morning and the evening? So we know that there were two primary offerings in the temple, in the morning and at night. So he says, in the morning and in the evening, the priests would offer offerings. That's in the morning. And in the evening, they would divide and take their portion of the sacrifices. That's the interpretation that Rashi quotes from Onkelos to explain the entire verse. So this is very detailed. I just want to give a quick summary, and then we get into the question. Then we get into the Kabbalah and what's really happening here. So in short, what does this verse mean? So Rashi says as follows: Binyamin is a devouring wolf. First interpretation, it's talking about the story of the concubine of Giva, where the members of Benjamin have to grab wives because the parents and the families don't want to promise not to give the wives to these terrible people of the tribe of Benjamin. Second interpretation, it's referring, says Rashi, it's referring to a very positive story, the story of Shaul, Saul, the first king of Israel, who devours all his enemies. And then the next clause, morning and evening. Morning is Saul, evening is after the sun sets, when the Jewish people are in exile, and they are exiled to Babylon. And over there, Mordechai and Esther get the spoils, they get the house of Haman. And then Rashi is kind enough to bring another interpretation. If you don't like the first interpretation of Giva, the concubine of Giva, and you don't like it, and you don't like Saul, you can read this entire interpretation, this entire verse completely different. That what is the devouring wolf? That's the temple. And the morning and the evening is the morning. The priests offer their offerings on the temple, and in the evening they divide the spoil. They divide the portions of the animals that the priests eat, and that's the meaning of dividing the spoils. So now we have the entire puzzle. We have all the moving pieces. Now I already alluded to our greatest question of why we're mentioning the concubine of Giva, but now we have our pieces. Now we can start putting the puzzle together. But in the meantime, because there's a lot of details, if anybody has any questions or comments, or telling me which interpretation you like and which one you don't, and if you like Rashi, or you like Rashi's first interpretation or second interpretation, or you prefer Onkelos, whatever you like, whatever you want to share, now's a good time. Otherwise, we continue. Go ahead.
Rabbi, I have a question for you. Could you speak a word about who was Onkelos?
Who is Onkelos? Onkelos is a translation of the Torah into Aramaic. And like any translation, this is case in point. He's not really a translation, it's really an interpretation. He doesn't translate literally. In this case, he doesn't mention wolf. He goes straight to the interpretation. He says, Benjamin Benjamin, in his section, the temple will be built. Who was Onkelos? Onkelos was a Roman convert. He was the nephew of Titus, who was the Roman general who destroyed the second temple. And he converted to Judaism, and he moved to Israel, and he studied Torah. That is, those stories are recorded in the Talmud, how his uncle tried to get him back to Rome and tried to harm him. Bottom line is, he stayed in Israel and was able to get away from his uncle, and he translated the Torah into Aramaic. He is a very early commentator. If you think about it, it's a very early commentary, because the Mishnah was not written. The Mishnah was the Mishnah was written a little bit after the destruction, but the Medrash was not codified. It wasn't written down until a few hundred years later, right? The Medrash was written down by the Amoraim, the sages of the Talmud, not the sages of the Mishnah. So I would say we're talking about at least 350 years or 400 years after Onkelos, where the Medrash is written down. So this is a very early commentary, translation, but commentary. And that's why Rashi often quotes the Onkelos. He doesn't always agree, but he quotes him. Now, Onkelos becomes part of the Torah study. There is a, virtually every Chumash that's printed has the Onkelos on the side. There is a law that we're supposed to study every Friday. You're not supposed to show up in shul and hear the Torah reading in public for the first time without understanding what's going on. You have to prepare. So there's something called Shnaya Mikra, which literally means twice the scripture. And basically what it means is every Friday, you're supposed to read, if not Friday, then Shabbos, but you're supposed to do it on Friday, it's better. You're supposed to read the verse, every verse in the parsha, twice the verse, and once the Aramaic translation of Onkelos. So it becomes literally part of Jewish culture and Jewish law. Now, he has different agendas than Rashi. He doesn't always look for the most simple, straightforward interpretation. There's all kinds of theories of how he differs from Rashi and what his overarching purpose in his interpretation is. But Rashi quotes him quite often, especially when things are poetic, where it's not clear what the verses mean. But Rashi quotes him means that it's significant. And therefore, in this case, Rashi is basically endorsing his interpretation. If you don't like my first interpretations, you could read this entire verse talking not about the concubine at Giva, not about Saul, not about Mordechai and Esther. You could say it's talking about the holy temple which was in the portion of Benjamin, because the temple was at the border of Benjamin and Judah. And people say that the altar was in the section of Benjamin. So the border between the land of Benjamin, between the Nachla, between the inheritance of Benjamin and Judah, ran right in the temple.
Why did Onkelos take a Jewish name?
I don't know. I'm sure there were many Jews at that point that didn't have Jewish names. In other words, we're talking about a time with its Greek influences and many influences in Israel. And there's people like Sumchus, a great sage. It's not a Jewish name. I don't think it's a Jewish name. Why didn't he take a Jewish name? I don't know. I have to look into that. Maybe he didn't. Maybe I don't know. That's a good question. Okay, now we get to the big question which I alluded to earlier, and that is we're talking about the blessing to Benjamin. The blessing to Benjamin has to be something positive, and yet Rashi has the first interpretation. He says that Jacob on his deathbed, blessing his son, is evoking the most terrible event in the history of the tribe of Benjamin, maybe even in the history of Israel as a whole. With the story with the Pilegesh, the concubine of Kivla. How is that a blessing? And why is that Rashi's first interpretation? Remember, Rashi has other alternatives. Rashi could say it's talking about Saul, that's the second interpretation, and Rashi could say it's talking about the temple, which is the third interpretation, the Onkelos interpretation, which are beautiful, inspiring interpretations. Why does Rashi drop those interpretations and instead take an interpretation that says that Jacob is evoking such a terrible scenario? There's only 600 Jews, Benjaminites left, and we have a problem. What are we going to do? And we have to find someone, let them grab wives for marriage, which is not the normal way of marriage. So how is this a blessing? That's the big question. And the answer, the Hasidic answer, is the Rebbe taught this in the year 1984, and I read it in the Rebbe's in the published version. But then I realized a lot of when the Rebbe taught during on Shabbat, so there's no tape, there's no recording because it was Shabbat. It was transcribed after Shabbat. But I realized that this talk I saw last night. This talk was said on Friday afternoon. So there's a tape now. Who speaks on Friday afternoon? Friday afternoon, you have to get ready for Shabbos. You have to make the cholent. You have to put up the potato kugel. So when do you have time to teach Torah on Friday afternoon? So what happened to be, it was a fast day. Just like last Friday. Last Friday was the fast day, the 10th of Tevis, which is the only fast day that can occur on Friday. Without getting into those details, we should have spoken about it last week. But in any case, so it was Friday afternoon on the fast day. And on the fast day, every fast day, the Rebbe would speak and teach Torah. So the Rebbe taught Torah. And then he said, you know what? We're going to talk about this week's Parsha, today's Parsha, the sixth reading, Benjamin. And what is the idea of a fast day? The idea of fast day is repentance. And the Rebbe taught it. And this morning, I listened to it in the car. Beautiful, beautiful talk. How passionate the Rebbe was is fascinating. Beautiful talk. And the Rebbe says like this. The Rebbe says, I'm paraphrasing. But what the Rebbe says is, listen, the greatest blessing that Jacob gives is the last. Remember, he saves the best for the last. And we know he loves Benjamin so much, right? We know that even when he was told that the leader of Egypt is not going to sell them food unless they bring Benjamin, Jacob says, no, I'm not taking Benjamin out of my possession. I'm afraid something will happen to him. So it's clear that Benjamin has a very deep space in Jacob's heart. And we know what Judah tells Joseph before he knew he was Joseph. He said, if you're going to take Benjamin, Jacob is going to die if I come back without Benjamin. Why? He says a very powerful phrase, last week's Parsha, B'nafshay kshura b'nafshay. His soul is bound up with his soul. They're tied up. They have a very deep, powerful connection. So certainly Benjamin is getting the last blessing because he's getting the most powerful, most profound blessing. Now, there are some very beautiful blessings before. Asher has a lot of oil. Naphtali is like a quick gazelle. Rashi says his land will give produce very quickly. Every Friday when I studied in Tzfat for a year, every Friday we would drive back down from Tzfat to Tveria, which is the land of Naphtali, and we would see the valley called Valley of Ginusar, and that was the first fruit in Israel would grow there, and you could literally see the beautiful blessings of Naphtali. And there's so many beautiful blessings, but we have to get to the ultimate blessing. What's the ultimate blessing? So the Rebbe says, you know what the greatest blessing is? Not that you're righteous, not that everything goes well, that's fine. The greatest blessing is that even when you are in the most terrible situation, and it looks like both physically, morally, politically, you just lost a civil war, the entire tribe is wiped out. The greatest blessing you can achieve is to be able to have the power of teshuvah, repentance, to turn around and start building again. And this is something I have not seen in any of the commentaries. I don't think anybody says this. But the Rebbe says, what does it mean? Don't think that other tribes had compassion on Benjamin just because the Benjamin would be wiped out. It's not only that. It's also that those 600 people who remained, they repented, they transformed, they felt bad, they showed that they felt bad. And that's why the Jewish people said, oy vey, the people of Teshuvah, we have to give them a path back into Judaism. And in that sense, that's the greatest blessing. And if you look at our history, there are many kingdoms who were very powerful, and many kingdoms were very successful. But once they were attacked, once they were exiled, once they were ran over by other empires, they're gone. And what's the power of Benjamin's blessing? That no matter, even when you're in the worst possible situation, you could devour, you could turn around, you could transform, you could start rebuilding. And then the Rebbe says like this, what does devour mean? Devour means you're taking something and you're grabbing it. It means it takes a tremendous amount of force. The second interpretation of Rashi is that we're talking about Saul, grabbing plunder from the enemy. In other words, you're grabbing away from somebody else. But the Rebbe says that the first interpretation of Rashi is actually much harder. The greatest, what's hard, it's easier to fight an enemy than to fight the self, to transform the self, to pull yourself away from old habits, to pull oneself away from old patterns of behavior. For Benjamin, for the tribe of Benjamin, the survivors of the tribe of Benjamin to turn around and to change, that is very difficult. They're devouring, they're grabbing themselves away and pulling themselves away from their old habits. That takes a lot of force, much more force than just a person who never sinned and is going in the straight and narrow path. And the Rebbe says that's what ties into a fast day, because it's teshuvah. That's the theme of repentance. So while many of the previous blessings where Jacob is talking to his sons about how wonderful and how glorious their life is going to be because they're serving God and they're studying Torah and they're farming the land and living in peace and harmony. That's all wonderful. But what the greatest blessing is that even when you fail and you fail miserably and you're at the cliff of the abyss, nevertheless, you could transform. And that is the blessing to Benjamin, and that's the greatest blessing of all. Now, I mentioned before that this is the sixth section of the Torah, of the Parsha, and it's the only blessing that's in the sixth section. All the blessings to the other 11 children are in reading 4 and 5. Benjamin is the only blessing in reading 6. So we have to say that this blessing is specifically connected to the other themes in reading 6. Okay, what are the other themes in reading 6? And I'm going to say it's not only reading 6, it's reading 6 is the culmination and reiteration of everything that happens in the second half of the book of Genesis. So what happens at the second half of number 6? So what happens is as follows. Jacob dies. Jacob is buried. And they come back to Egypt. The entire family comes back to Egypt. What happens now? Now the brothers are frightened because they think that Joseph never forgave them. And the reason why Joseph was kind to them over the past 17 years is because of his father. He didn't want to upset his father. But now that the father is gone, they feel threatened. They feel Joseph will punish them. So let's read some of the verses. Let's see what they do. Let's see what they say. Let's see how this connects to the concept of devouring of Benjamin and the concept of repentance. So let's share the screen again. Let's see what happens.
Rabbi, can I ask another question?
Please.
So Benjamin is called a wolf. Where does wolf show up prior to this in the Torah, in the book of Genesis?
The actual word wolf, I don't know if it does.
So this is the first mention of wolf?
As far as I can remember. Okay. As far as I can remember. Okay, so we're sharing the screen, reading 6. Jacob passes away in verse 33. In chapter 50, all again, the same 6th reading. We have the burial procession, all wonderful things. They come back. Now Joseph's brothers saw that, I'm reading for 15. Now Joseph's brothers saw that their father had died, and they said, perhaps Joseph will hate us and return to us all the evil that we did to him. So they commanded messengers to go to Joseph to say, They make up a story, nonsense. Most people, virtually all the commentaries believe this was not true. But they say as follows, to say, your father commanded us before his death, saying, so shall you say to Joseph, please forgive now your brother's transgression and their sin, for they did evil to you. Now, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also went and fell before him, and they said, behold, we are your slaves. Right? That's measure for measure. They sold him as a slave. Now he should punish them, and they should be slaves. Verse 19. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid, for am I instead of God? And now we have verse 20, which is the last verse of the sixth reading. We're going to relate it to the first verse of the sixth reading. Indeed, you intended evil against me, but God designated for good, in order to bring about what is present, to keep a great populace, in order to keep about what is at present, to keep a great populace alive. What is Joseph saying? Yeah, of course you had a bad intention. But don't worry, God had a good intention. What was the good intention? So we can keep a great populace alive. He may have meant all of Egypt. He may have meant the entire region. He may have meant their family. I don't know. Okay, so I'm asking you a question. Did I ever ask this question? Joseph wants to appease or pacify or make his brothers feel good. So what should he have said? He should have said, look, it was God's plan and it's for the good. But Joseph doesn't say that, or he doesn't only say that. He emphasizes, and he emphasizes the fact you intended it for bad, yet God intended it for good. So why does he have to keep emphasizing that you intended it for bad? And it happens not only here, but also in last parsha. With Joseph, the first time he reveals himself to them and they're frightened, he says, don't worry, I know you intended it for bad, God intended it for good. And here is the same thing. Here he says it again. You intended it for bad, God intended it for good. Why do you have to emphasize that you intended it for bad? Just say God intended it for good. Again, he's trying to pacify them. He's not trying to lecture them. He's not trying to give them a sermon. He's not trying to inspire them to repent or to give money to charity for atonement. No, he's trying to make them feel good. So why emphasize that you intended it for bad and God intended it for good? So what the Rebbe says is as follows, beautiful, sweeter than honey. He says the whole purpose of what Joseph is trying to say is the power of transformation. The deep idea that you have in the second half of the book of Genesis, which is basically the story of Jacob and his wives, which creates the animosity, which creates the sale of Joseph, is that in this world, every situation could be transformed to the good. There's always something good that can happen from the bad. Even though we plan for bad or people plan for the bad, God has a positive intention. Now, what that positive intention is, every place is different. With Joseph, it was very easy to see. With us, it may not be in the real world. It may be what it will do to us. It will make us better people. There's a purpose. It's going to help somebody else. But there always is something good that can grow from a negative situation. That is what Joseph is emphasizing. He's not saying ignore the evil. He's saying the big idea here is that despite the fact that you considered for evil, God is greater than you. God doesn't have to ignore the evil. God gives us the power to transform the evil to something positive. And that is actually the same theme as the blessing to Benjamin. The blessing to Benjamin is that when you're going to be in a situation of Pilegesh Begiva, where the concubine and the Giva, where the tribe of Benjamin was so sinned to the degree, first of all, they did not stand up for justice for this poor concubine. And they did not even want to prosecute the crime, which means they endorse it. And they have to be wiped out, or many of them. Terrible tragedy. Yet the power, the blessing is that this can actually create a greater commitment to Judaism and to goodness and to holiness. Now, the Rebbe doesn't say it, but I want to say this. The most unbelievable thing, and that's alluded to, I think, in the second interpretation of Rashi. So the end of the book of Judges is this terrible story, the Pilegesh concubine of Giva, the moral and political downfall of the people of Benjamin. Now, if you knew nothing about Jewish history, and I say a short while after, maybe one generation, maybe many generations, it's not clear when the story happened. Some people said it happened in the beginning of the story of Judges. I don't know when it happened, But what I do know is where it's placed in the book. It's placed in the book at the end of the period of the judges. After that, you go straight to the book of Samuel, which is the life of Samuel, who then appoints Saul. So if I tell you, if all you knew is you finished reading the book of Judges, and you see this terrible situation of the descendants of Saul, of descendants of Benjamin, and then I say, you know what, we're going to pick a Jewish king, and the Jewish king is going to be blessed by God, and he's going to fight all the enemies, and he's going to literally be called the Mashiach Hashem, the anointed one of God. And I say, which tribe do you think this king will come from? You would never say Benjamin. Benjamin? I just read what happened to Benjamin. They were wiped out. Only 600 remaining people. Why? Because of the terrible immorality that they displayed and the indifference to justice that they displayed. And yet, what happens? The first king is specifically from Benjamin. So what does that show you? To show you the power of transformation. Because they realized they fell so low, they transformed, they were able to produce from amongst their midst a man like Shaul, like Saul. So this is just, you see how powerful this idea of transformation is and how it's the greatest blessing. So the greatest blessing, if you want it, we could translate it to all our lives. You could translate it to so many areas. The greatest blessing to teach ourselves, teach our children, society, is not the blessing of being righteous and we're never going to fail, because that doesn't create the true goodness. The true goodness is when a person fails and tastes the bitterness of failure and then transforms those feelings into energy that will make them grow. That's the greatest blessing. And that, again, is not only the Benjamin, but it's also the overarching story of the second half of the book of Genesis. I think where, again, the whole purpose of the story is to tell us that God gives Joseph the power, and therefore gives us the power to transform the terrible situation of being sold into slavery, being put into prison, and that you could transform that to giving life to the Jewish people and to the world and to society as a whole. And that is what Joseph represents. So that's the story in short. I was very moved by this. Thank you for joining. I also wrote it up for the weekly email. You get into your inbox. Unfortunately, only 700 words. So we're not able to put everything in there, but at least it will be a short review. If you want to look out for it in your inbox. Thank you. Have a wonderful Shabbos. Happy 2021, and only good things.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. Very good.
Thank you, Rabbi. I have a question for you. In line 20, it says "Vatem chashavtem." Doesn't chashavtem, at least in modern Hebrew, means think? Kavanah means intention, right?